Refugia Baca had a frail old woman to keep warm, the hardest cold New Mexico had seen in memory bearing down on the valley, and a house of mud that the American newcomers laughed at. It was the winter of 1886, in a valley of the New Mexico territory where the old Spanish families had farmed the bottomland for 100 years, and the Americans had lately come with lumber and papers and firm ideas about how a house ought to be built. Refugia's husband, Tomas, had died that autumn, a fever that took him in a week, and left her the old family place, a low house of adobe, thick-walled and flat-roofed, that his people had raised and replastered and lived in for 3 generations. He left her, too, his mother, old Encarnacion, past 80, half-blind, who could not be moved and could not be let to get cold. No husband, no children living, no one but the old woman and the winter coming. There was an American in the valley, a man named Colby, who had bought up land along the good bottom and considered the Baca place his the moment the widow could be got off it. He came in November, courteous and certain. He offered her a fair price to sign and go. He told her, not unkindly, that a mud house would not hold against a real cold, that a woman alone with an old one to nurse would be wiser in town, and that she ought to think of the winter. He looked on his way out at the horno, the round clay bread oven standing in the yard, and at the low earthen house behind it, and he saw plainly a poor and backward thing, the kind of place a new country was meant to replace. By the time the cold snap of that January had cracked the pipes and frozen the wells and left the fine American frame houses of the valley too cold to live in, the same newcomers who had called the Baca place a mud hut would be crossing the frozen fields to its door to borrow fire and to be let into the most even warm room in the valley. What Colby and the newcomers had never troubled to learn, what Tomas's people had known for 300 years, and the Pueblo people along that river longer than that, was the plain truth of what the mud house was. Earth, piled thick enough, is the finest keeper of heat a poor country has, and a house built of the ground holds its warmth the way the ground itself does. The walls of the Baca house were adobe, near 2 feet thick, mud and straw shaped into great blocks, dried in the sun, laid up and plastered smooth with more of the same earth. Walls that thick take the whole day to warm, and the whole night to give the warmth back. They drink the heat of a small fire and let it out slow and even, so that a room of adobe has no sharp cold corners and no dead cold at dawn, only a steady, ground-deep warmth. In the corner stood a small adobe fireplace, and out in the yard, the horno, and Encarnacion had lived her whole long life inside these walls and knew their every mood, though her eyes had gone. Where the Americans built a big room and heated the air of it and lost the heat through every thin wall as fast as a stove could make it, Refugia heated the walls. She did not build a roaring fire. She kept one small steady flame in the corner fireplace, day and night, and let the thick adobe soak it up and hold it, and she moved her own bed and the old woman's against the inner wall that stayed warmest, the wall the horno backed onto, that took the heat of every baking and kept it. When she fired the horno to bake, the whole house grew warmer for a day after. The old woman slept warm against the bread oven wall, and Refugia beside her, and the small fire cost them a fraction of what the valley was burning. She told the American nothing of it. He had not asked how a widow meant to keep an old woman alive in a mud house. He had only told her she could not. The cold that came down on the valley in the middle of January was the kind the old people would name for the rest of their lives. It fell far and stayed, and a dry wind came with it that found every crack a lumber house had. The new American houses, quick-built and thin-walled, leaked their heat into it. Families sat by roaring stoves and were cold 3 feet away, and burned wood at a rate that frightened them. The old adobe houses of the Spanish families fared better, as they always had. The Baca house, with its 2-foot walls and its one small fire, stayed even and warm. And in the middle of it, in her care for the old woman, Refugia made the mistake that nearly cost her the house. She had wanted the walls warmer still, for Encarnacion's sake, and she had seen the Americans bank snow against the north sides of their houses to keep the wind off, and she had thought to do the same, to pack the drifted snow up against the outside of the thick adobe as one more blanket. She did not know, or did not think in her grief and her tiredness, the one thing every child raised in an earthen house is taught before it can walk: that adobe has a single enemy in all the world, and its name is water. Earth dried hard as brick is strong past believing. Dry. Wet, it remembers what it is. It goes back to mud. The warm wall melted the snow she had banked against it. The meltwater soaked down into the foot of the wall through the long, cold nights and the short, thawing days, and the adobe drank it and softened. One gray morning, Refugia came around the north corner and saw the plaster bulging and sliding off in wet sheets, and the great blocks beneath going dark and soft and losing their shape. The corner of her house slumping visibly back toward the field it had been dug from. Above it, where the flat earthen roof met the failing wall, a viga, one of the peeled log beams that held the roof, had begun to sag as its bed of adobe turned soft under it. It was the blind old woman who named it. Encarnacion heard the wet plaster fall and Refugia's cry, and from her bed she said the thing her own mother had said to her 70 years before. Never snow, never water against the walls. The wall is the ground, and the ground drinks. Refugia stood in the ruin of the corner and understood what she had done. Earth is warm, and earth is strong, and earth is mud the moment it is wet, and she had carried its one enemy to it with her own hands, meaning to help. She saved the house, but it cost her. She dug every last shovelful of snow away from the walls, all the way around in the killing cold, and cut a shallow drain to carry the melt away from the foundation. She moved Encarnacion to the cold entry, wrapped in every blanket, while the wall stood open to the air. She shored the sagging viga with a post cut and wedged from beneath. And then she mixed fresh adobe, earth and straw and water worked by hand in a cold that wanted to freeze it before she could use it, and replastered the softened corner and packed the wall true again, day after cold, wet day, until it held. She lost near a week of the horno's warmth to it, and the old woman took a chill in the cold entry that settled into a cough and frightened them both, and Refugia's hands cracked and bled from the cold, wet clay. She paid all of it. A house of earth, she learned past forgetting, must be kept dry as bone, and the warmth that is its gift will melt the very snow that ruins it if you are fool enough to bring them together. There was an evening, the old woman coughing and the corner not yet dry, when Refugia sat with Colby's offer turning in her mind, and thought that perhaps he had been right, that a mud house was a poor, frail thing, that she should take his money and carry Encarnacion to 4 honest board walls in town before her own tiredness killed them both. She went so far as to take out the paper he had left. Then the old woman, half asleep, murmured something in the old way about the house her husband's grandfather had raised, and Refugia looked at the wall she had just saved, warm and even and 3 generations deep, and she put the paper back in the box. The house had shown her its one weakness. It had also kept an 80-year-old woman warm through cold that was freezing the newcomers out of their proud, clear rooms. She would keep it dry, and she would keep it. By the deep of the cold, the valley's new houses were failing in earnest. The pipes went, and the wells, and a family on the next claim moved into their own stable with the animals for the warmth. And one bitter evening, an American, one of Colby's own newcomers, a man named Pratt, whose stove could not hold his house, came to the Baca door, half ashamed, to ask whether the widow could spare live coals from her oven to start his fire fresh, his own having died in the night. Refugia brought him in out of the wind, and Pratt stood in the low earthen room and felt what it was. No roaring fire anywhere, only a small, even flame in the corner, and yet a steady, ground-deep warmth in every part of it. Warm in the corners, warm at the floor, an old half-blind woman sleeping easy against a wall that held the day's heat like a stone in the sun. He asked how. He could not help asking how. Refugia showed him. The thick earthen walls, the one small fire, the beds against the warm wall, the horno's heat kept in the adobe. She showed him that the trick the whole valley was missing was not a bigger fire, but a wall that would hold the heat of a small one, and that the mud house Colby called backward was doing, on a few sticks a day, what Pratt's fine lumber house could not do on an armload. Pratt had come from a country of forests and had never once had to think what a wall was for. He was not the last. Word went through the American end of the valley, the way a useful thing goes through a cold place, and before the snap broke, Refugia had opened her door to a half-dozen families and shown any who asked how an earthen house is kept and warmed, and let the worst off sleep on her warm floor by the bread oven wall. Some of them began to speak to the old Spanish families they had held themselves apart from, and to ask how a thing was done that those families had been doing quietly for 300 years. Colby did not speak again of moving the widow off. A man does not easily buy, for the price of a mud hut, the warmest and soundest house in a valley that has just watched his own kind freeze. Refugia did not charge, and she did not gloat, and she said nothing of the man who had called her house a backward thing. She only showed anyone who asked, because a house that keeps an old woman alive is not a knowledge you hoard. She kept the Baca place all her life, and she kept it dry, and every year she replastered the walls with fresh earth in the old way, Encarnacion's way, her husband's grandfather's way. On the cold nights, the 2-foot walls held the small fire's warmth till dawn, even and deep. And the newcomers who had learned the hard winter's lesson kept their own earth walls after, and the ones who had not went on being cold in their proud, thin houses and calling it progress. The house is only the ground, Refugia used to say, and the ground is patient and warm and old, and it asks one thing of you in return for keeping you alive. Keep it dry, and it will hold you the way it held everyone who came before. If this story made you think of someone whose old, plain, laughed-at way turned out to be the thing that kept people alive, leave their name in the comments. And if you want to hear more of these stories, the women the frontier underestimated and what they quietly knew, subscribe. We tell them one at a time, and we don't rush them.